The information contained in this video is strictly for informational purposes only and does not constitute financial, legal, or other professional advice and is not a substitute for consultation with a qualified professional. The opinions expressed in the show do not necessarily reflect the views of the Center for Continuing Education and Workforce Development, Borough of Manhattan Community College, and the City University of New York. State of Mind is a web-based discussion program that explores the relevant social, economic, and political issues that are prominent at the post-secondary level of education. State of Mind is sponsored by the Center for Continuing Education and Workforce Development at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. BMCC. Start here, go anywhere. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Krishna C. Nadella, and this is State of Mind. Continuing on our Cost of Education series, today's topic is about borrowing for college. Earlier this year, Mark Cuban, the outspoken owner of the Dallas Mavericks, sounded off in regards to the perceived student loan bubble and its similarities with the housing bubble of 2008. With easy money being made available to the tune of over $1 trillion in student loan debt, it begs the question that should be on the minds of all prospective and current students before they borrow money for college. Is the student loan bubble going to burst? Back with us to help better understand our topic and provide their perspectives are the following guests. Reyna Gobel is a freelance journalist and author who writes specifically on the area of student loans and debt. Debra Chromy is the president of the Education Finance Council. And Joseph Brusuelas is the chief economist at McGladrey Incorporated. Reyna, Debra, Joe, thanks for joining us again today.
Thank you.
Now, before we get started, I'd like to just take a moment to mention that our parent sponsor, the Borough of Manhattan Community College, offers a quality education at an extremely reasonable price. This is something that we take great pride with here at the BMCC and will play very much into the show as we move forward. So with that said, I want to kind of start off the show with a few questions about what type of funding is available from a debt standpoint, and what are the various aspects of debt that one has to look at? Why don't we start with you, Debra?
Sure. So there are a couple different categories, I will say, of student loans that are available to families. The first one that everyone should look at is the federal student loan program, and that's broken into a couple of different categories. There's the Stafford loan, and there's a subsidized Stafford and an unsubsidized Stafford. The subsidized Stafford, and that means the federal government's paying the interest for you while you're in school. The subsidized Stafford is based on need, so financial need. So in order to be eligible for that, and actually to be eligible for all the federal programs, a student must fill out the FAFSA, which is the free application for student financial aid.
I think you got it.
I think I got it, the FAFSA. And so, as I said, the subsidized Stafford is the one that's based on financial aid. The unsubsidized Stafford is not based on financial aid, but you still have to, financial need, but you still have to fill out the FAFSA to be eligible for it. Then there is the parent loan program. It's parent loan for undergraduate students plus, which is available for parents to take out for their children's cost of education. And then there's also something called the Grad Plus, which is similar to the PLUS program, but it's for graduate students. So I would always start with the federal programs first. There's another federal program called the Perkins loan, but the Perkins loan, it's also a very low interest rate. It's made available through colleges and universities. Not all colleges and universities participate in it, so you'll have to check with your individual institution, but also has a very low interest rate. And then once you've exhausted all those, if you still have financial need, there are other programs that are available. Many of the EFC organizations, in fact, offer low-cost loans to students, usually co-signed by a parent. And because these loans are made with tax-exempt bond financing, they tend to be very competitive, have very low interest rates. There are some states also that provide very low-cost and sometimes zero interest free loans. So it's really important to check either with your high school guidance counselor if you're still in high school, or if you're in college, checking with your college financial aid office to find out what's available within your state. And then sort of the last group are the private loans that are made available through banks and commercial organizations. And those tend to have, although they vary, they tend to be more expensive with upfront fees, and the interest rate is variable based on your credit rating. So that's sort of the laundry list. And I think, Reyna, I've hit them all. Have I missed any?
No, I think there's a couple of things that are really different that have happened recently that I would definitely want to talk about, which is private student loans have gotten a lot lower in the interest rates than they used to, and can often have lower interest rates than federal student loans. If you're going back for grad school and you're going to be working the whole time and you're taking out $10,000 or so and you'll be able to pay it off within a few years, they're really a good option nowadays. And I think another thing to pinpoint with the federal student loans, and actually when it comes to those PLUS loans versus the private loans, parents, if you are considering getting out loans and you're thinking, I don't want to do this PLUS loan because I don't want it in my name, guess what? If you co-sign that private loan, it's yours, except for you have less control of it and less options for temporarily getting out of payments if you need to take a payment break. And one thing I see a lot that parents don't understand with getting out those private loans for their kids is that they'll think, oh, you know, with the federal loans, if you do have an income situation, you get a break for a little while.
Right.
And so they think that's based on the student's income. Well, it's not. So if you're a parent that makes a good income and you've got 2 kids in school, it really doesn't matter. They're going to look at your income. They're going to look at the fact that you've got great credit, and they're going to say your child does not get a break while they are trying to work harder to make more money. So you're really better off with PLUS loans if it's simply a co-signing issue of you don't want to be responsible for that loan, because you're responsible either way.
Yeah, I agree.
So we talked about in our previous episode about the need going forward for most parents and most families to probably think about saving for college, but also probably taking out some debt. That's something you had mentioned, Debra. Joe, what I'd like to ask you from your standpoint as an economist is, over the last quarter century, how has that dichotomy played out from saving for college versus taking debt out of one's...
Okay, so we've moved from savings and paying out of pocket to almost exclusively relying on debt. After the housing bubble burst and the ensuing financial crash and Great Recession, the total amount of outstanding student loan debt more than doubled. And you'll see on the data visualization that we're rapidly approaching $1.3 trillion in outstanding debt. Now, that was a pretty interesting comment by Mark Cuban, but he was wrong. It's not the housing bubble that it looks like. It looks like the savings and loan crisis from the late 1980s and early 1990s. And while I think that there's a little bit too much fear being spread about widespread defaults, I'm not really concerned about defaults. Now, honestly, there's a problem with defaults in terms of the for-profit loans that are made to people going to for-profit schools as opposed to traditional 4-year not-for-profit universities. And I think that Congress ought to look into that. Now, I'm not worried about widespread default. What I'm worried about is the legacy of this debt and how it shapes the millennials' attitudes and behavior on spending, on savings, and on investment. Now, the Federal Reserve has done a series of very interesting research on how that legacy debt is impacting our economy, and it's impacting our economy in the following ways. Okay, one, people who have heavy loads of outstanding debt are spending less on autos. 2, if you take a look at the employment to population ratio of those aged 25 to 34, it's a good forward-looking indicator on where residential investment is in the country, i.e. housing starts. Now, after the bubble, housing starts slowed significantly. In terms of our own long-term equilibrium, housing starts should be at about 1.6 million on an annualized basis. 7 years after the bubble burst, we're still bumping along the line at around 1 million on an annualized basis, and that line sits pretty much on top that employment to population ratio of people aged 25 to 34. So we really are going to have to take a look at not only how we make student loans, but the quantity of loans that are made available. And of course, it's going to start at home. While I think that there's a really good case to be made for traditional liberal arts and humanities, I think that expectations of employment, expectations about income ought to come into the equation when we're making decisions about what sort of levels of debt to take on when we're going to school. As an economist, we probably ought to charge more tuition for people who are in the liberal arts and humanities in order to drive that number down and send them back over into the sciences, because those are the skill sets that have to be developed. And I think that there's also a misnomer out there. People should go to school. We need more education. But you have to be wise about the education you're purchasing. And you have to be reasonable about the expectations in terms of income over your lifetime.
So I want to talk a little bit more about the millennials, because that is really the crux of this conversation. What we're hearing are 2 terms that seem to be prevalent with them going forward, boomerang and underemployed. Now, for those in our audience that are wondering what we mean by boomerang generation, it is those individuals that go to college, typically a 4-year college, who then move out of, try to get a job, aren't necessarily successful, end up moving back home with their parents and becoming dependent on their parents. It's a real issue right now in society, and it's one where it really begs the question of how is that altering the economy as a whole. The other is the underemployment issue, where individuals are getting jobs that are not commensurate with their degrees as well. How does that play into this, Joe, and are we looking at potential lost generation going forward?
Okay, so we have to look at it this way. So the overall unemployment rate's around 5.9%, but that grossly exaggerates the true condition of the labor market. If you look at what's called the underemployment rate, the unemployment rate's around 12%. Now, we've got 7.2 million people who are working part-time for economic reasons, meaning they want to work full-time, but they can't get full-time work, or B, they were working full-time and they got their hours cut. So we have a real problem with underemployment in the economy. And unfortunately, a lot of young people, they got jobs, it didn't work out, and then they fall into extended bouts of unemployment. And once you're unemployed for more than, say, 30 weeks, it's very difficult to get that job back. Your skill sets deteriorate, your social network disperses, and you're finding some real problems there. Now, in terms of the millennials, it's hitting them the hardest. They're not seeing job growth, and they're not seeing wage growth that typically one would see at that period of their work or career lives. I don't think that we have a lost generation. These are bright young people who can do things. I think that they weren't necessarily well served by the educational establishment. I think that there's a problem with some of the skill sets that they've got developed. In some cases, and this is going to be tough for the millennials because they like to think of themselves as achievers or overachievers.
Right.
They're going to have to go back and do some heavy lifting in the areas of statistics, science, and mathematics, so they can take those good technological skill sets they have, and they sure know how to use technology, and reorient it so that they can actually fill demand out there for work. And that's the thing that's most discouraging. Now, what I worry about long term is they're going to choose not to invest. They're going to choose just to spend. They're going to put off big life decisions, marriage, childbirth, the forming of what we would call traditional households, and that will impact the economy in negative ways, specifically in the areas I mentioned earlier, residential investment. Our economy depends quite a bit on the creation of households and demand for new homes. And that continues to be one of the more disappointing areas of the economy coming out of the recession. What I also worry about is the sort of the lifetime income horizons. If they form lower expectations, you're going to have lower rates of savings, lower rates of investment, and even lower rates of spending. And that's the exact opposite of what we want, given where we think educational costs will be over the next 2 decades.
So let's talk about educational costs. And Reyna, I want to direct this question to you. Is there a direct correlation between rising college tuitions with the availability of easy credit that's currently existing right now in today's society? And if so, what does that mean long term for universities as a whole, and then for those that borrow money to go to those same universities?
Well, I think what it comes down to is being a good consumer, and that's what it comes to all around, is that when you're looking at your education, and this will affect universities as well, is that you really think, what kind of value am I getting for this? What is this college doing for me that another college can't? And I disagree with Joe a little bit on the idea of choosing a science degree. So some people go to school for a science degree, they'll get out, they have no idea what they want to do. And they may not even like science, but they think that's where I'm going to make the money. Instead, just think about what you're borrowing in whole, because what 18-year-old really knows what they want to do?
Sure.
And a lot of CEOs have psychology degrees, and they make more money than anybody.
Right.
So I think that what it really comes down to is more of a focus on careers, that you're starting off from day one. Even in kindergarten, you start getting exposure to different careers. Right. So the more that you're doing shadow days, the more there's a focus on internships, the more people are looking at career services as an essential part of their college choice, then I think that these numbers are going to get better. And I think that if consumers are smart and they're looking at what a college costs, that's going to change the price of college. And especially if they are looking at their awards package and they know the difference between, I just got student loan money versus I just got scholarship or grant money or endowment money, which endowment money is at a liberal arts or an Ivy League school or even some other colleges as well, where basically the college just has funding from alumni and they pass that onward to you. So knowing that and just being a good consumer overall is what's going to make the difference in the overall cost of college going forward.
I see you're nodding your head,
Yeah,
Debra.
yeah, so there's just one comment I want to make about that. And, you know, it used to be, at least when I went to college, the norm was 4 years of college. That's not the norm anymore. It can take 5 or 6 years. And part of that is that students enter college and they think that they know what they want to do, and then they may change their major 1 or 2 different times, or they may change which institution they're going to, and that may change. They may need to have some more courses because some of their courses didn't transfer, whatever it may be. So I think when people are looking at the cost of college, they need to look beyond just the 4-year price tag, because it more than likely is going to be 5 or 6 years, and take that into consideration.
And one other thing too, I want to make sure, because she brought this up, it's about skill sets. It's not necessarily about majors. That you can be in a humanities or liberal arts degree that's got a good quantitative skill set that underscores it, right? What I worry about is some of the second or third tier universities where that's not the case. Then we're going to run into some problems, and you're going to have people who've taken on just too much debt relative to what they're reasonably going to be expected to make. And I think this is one of the times where we have a certain form of educational malpractice out there, because we're urging people to take on debt, but they're not getting the quality education that they should. And I mean, I'm going to be blunt here. I mean, I've worked with individuals who from Ivy Leagues who supposedly have good degrees, who don't have the skill sets that we expected when we hired them. Point blank, they didn't get it. So there's a pervasive problem out there, not just in the primary system of education, but in our higher system of education. And I think that we have to hold these institutions to account for the product that they're producing. And then this is where I'm really concerned about legacy debt and the millennials, which is the question you asked, because they really got stuck with unusually high levels of debt in order to complete their educations. And in many cases, I mean, I've seen it too many times now for it to be anecdotal. They just don't have the skill sets that one would have expected that would have come along with purchasing those degrees.
All right. Full disclosure to our audience, I actually majored as a biochemist, and obviously I'm not doing that anymore. But going back to what we were talking about earlier about colleges, rising tuition, and of course the rising debt that comes with it. And paralleling that, you said more to savings and loans versus the housing bubble. Is there a concept that we can use as a parallel, such as too big to fail, Joe, from the standpoint of when we looked at banks to what we're looking at in terms of colleges now?
Okay, no, I think that there's a fair parallel here. So after the housing bubble burst and we had a near financial catastrophe, there were reforms that were put in both domestically and international. So domestically, we enacted Dodd-Frank, which targeted the financial sector for massive reform. And in next year, we're going to have the Basel III standards imposed out of the Bank of International Settlements. And the common thread that runs through this is that there's a liquidity requirement. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that when banks make a loan and they securitize that loan, they have to retain some portion of responsibility for that debt. So in essence, they have skin in the game, and that's done so that there's an incentive for them to make good loans, not predator loans, right? Okay, the parallel is that if an educational system is going to continue to charge elevated levels of tuition, right, and they're going to encourage their students to take on elevated levels of debt, that they ought to have some skin in the game too. That colleges aren't too big to fail. And that I think there's this common sense educational reform going forward is we're going to make some very massive, we're going to be engaging a period of 10 to 20 years here of massive reform in this country. That this ought to be part of the process. That the education systems, our educational institutions ought to be made aware that yes, we're going to continue to subsidize these student loans, but you can't take advantage of this by continuing to raise costs. And indeed, many of these institutions, they spend more on administration than they do in terms of paying the professors. And to be fair, some of the dorms are more like playground than places where you're just living for a year before you move out into your own apartment. So there's a lot of change that's going to have to be made out there, but I do think that the main common sense reform is these banks ought to have skin on the game. So if there is a problem with default, or if there is a problem with repayment, colleges need to have skin in the games, yes, that they need to be part of that.
So schools like the BMCC, which I kicked off the episode talking about quality education for an extremely reasonable cost, this is not something that's going to necessarily take them off their current strategic path because they're already making sure they finance and provide funding available to their students.
No, not at all. What we're talking about is really the sort of the second tier and top tier state universities and private universities where the inflation in terms of tuition has been just tremendous over the past 15 to 20 years.
And you know, I would add to that, there is innovation going on in some of the colleges and universities and from outside around looking at how you might reimagine what education looks like. And there are a lot of conversations going on about, do you need 4 years? Is a 3-year degree? Can you get, and what does that look like? What is the combination of online education or some piece of online combined with brick and mortar sitting in a classroom, and thinking about how there are different ways, what are the different ways that you might be able to decrease the cost of delivering education. And we're in the process coming up in this next year of looking at reauthorizing the Higher Education Act, which is the act that makes available the student loans that we've been talking about today. And as part of that program, I believe they're already starting to have conversations about, should the colleges have skin in the game? How might we reform this? What should these programs look like? So I think all of this, I think Joe is right. There's going to be a lot of discussion about this in the coming year as to what higher education policy should look like. And I think colleges and universities are looking very closely because this is impacting them. As consumers are, you know, to Reyna's point, as consumers are being a little bit more savvy and shopping around, they're looking for that value for the education. And if you're not delivering it, then you're not going to be chosen. And so they need to start thinking about, and I believe they already are, about how they reimagine what they're doing on their campuses and what they stand for.
Reyna?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 key points I want to make. And I think one, you know, as Joe was saying about getting skin in the game, I think it's way overdue for colleges to have a financial literacy requirement, not a checklist, but real financial literacy. And before you give out a loan, there should be a requirement attached to that of, we're going to take you through an hour course, a 5-hour course, even online, where there's test scores or there's something that actually makes the school say, oh, we can't give out this load unless we do it. And that should be required every semester with each new loan. I think that's really important. And the second point is on workforce skills, which is something community colleges have really stepped up their game on. It's amazing how many accountants, it's not just that that people gotta go back for statistics. They've got to go back because they never learned how to work with other people. They need team building skills. And community colleges are filling those gaps for people with PhDs. Like, they're coming back, and there are workforce development departments that you should be in contact with that for a few $100s, you can get the skill set you need. So if you're a millennial and you feel stuck, you really need to think about that. What could I be doing even with a community college? I took courses before my MBA program at the community college for things I needed. And to kind of tie this together, I'm going to be teaching courses at the BMCC for financial professionals to learn about how student loans should be a part of someone's overall financial planning. So doing workshops for that, because it really is important, and that we think of everything as the big picture and kind of those skill sets you need to get to the next place in your life. And if you don't have them after your degree, go back to community college. You've already got that high-priced degree, or you've already got some degree. People know you have a degree. Now look at the skill set. And also, nothing's more important than getting internships and getting work education as you go. Don't just think of it as a job, but actual education. And always be networking with your professor, which is what I worry about with more online courses, is that, Debra, to your point about saving money, is that you can lose some of the networking aspects. And that's the other reason why you go to school, is to get that network. In Forbes' college ranking system, now they're ranking networking as the alumni as part of the scoring, because it's really important.
Yeah, but I think it's the way they're looking at technology. So instead of strictly online or strictly in classroom, there's some new ways that they're looking at that meld those two together. So you have classroom space and there's pieces of it that are online. So, which is, I think, the innovation that's starting to take place.
You just want to be careful which are online, and that you're still making an effort to call and communicate with your professor in some way, because you never know. That professor may be the one that gets you your after-college job.
Absolutely, I agree. And I'd like to add to her earlier point, Reyna's earlier point about financial literacy. There was a hearing in Washington. Department of Education had a hearing this week on pay-as-you-earn, and they had students and recent graduates speaking and testifying. And the thing that always blows me away is their comments were, No one told me how much debt I was getting into. No one told me about all the options that were available to repay their loan, et cetera. And a couple years ago, I stood up and spoke in front of a group of college students, recent graduates, and I asked them, they said, you know, one of them raised their hand, why isn't there a deferment if you're unemployed? And I said, well, there is.
Yes.
And then they said, how many people know? And I listed all of these options that are available, and like maybe 3 hands went up in this room full of like 500 recent grads. And I think the thing is that you have to, I think students need to take some responsibility for learning, because I agree, more education is always better, but there are requirements at the beginning about educating, and I know colleges and universities do try to reach out. I'm for much more education, like you spoke about, but you also have to take some responsibility. You're taking on a debt.
Right.
You know, I think about when you take on any other debt, you think about what you can afford. You look at interest rates, you pay attention to terms, you look at when I'm going to repay that over. But with education, it seems to be a bit different. People look at it from this perspective of, you know, I want to go to school, where do I sign?
Right.
So I think more can be done on both sides. There's more that colleges and universities can do, but there's a lot more that students and families can do about being educated and aware of what debt they're taking on and what the repayment options are that are available, because that information is out there. And it's not that difficult to find.
So on the topic of education, Reyna, I actually want to
Right.
defer to you because you actually run and moderate graduationdebt.org. How can that be a resource, and how can parents and students use that as a place that they can go to educate themselves?
Yeah, I think it's a great resource. What I do as a whole in my career is 80% of the time I'm getting the information out there. I had a default. And my default was for a silly reason. I didn't know 1 out of 16 loans existed. That's very common. Like, you have so many loans, and that's why it's important that people go to the National Student Loan Data System. I'm writing as a Forbes contributor online to educate people as different reforms come out. I have articles coming out for students on iGrad. I am in the media, and always ask me questions at Reyna Gobel. And then I have a video course on how to repay student loans. I have an audio course on how to pay for college. But just like wherever you can get that, and of course the book that was a 2-time winner of Michelle Singletary's Book of the Month in the Washington Post, Cliff's Notes Graduation Debt, How to Manage Money and Live Your Life. And what's really interesting about it is I made half the book about budgeting and credit and how to think about your loans in terms of how to buy a house and all these things. Because it's really, I don't want anyone to give up on the rest of their life because they have student loans. Right. There are great payment plans out there, and when you learn about them, your life is so much easier, and that boulder that you feel that your student loan debt is, it doesn't have to weigh the rest of your life down.
So I just actually want to end up the show with you, Joe, in terms of that very concept of being able to live the rest of your life. Our economy, as we see it right now, with so many of us having student loan debt that we're trying to pay off. Is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Do you think what the policies are being put in place from Capitol Hill will help alleviate some of that load?
Yeah, there's light at the end of the tunnel. That, you know, the great late economist Herbert Stein once said that if something bad usually goes on for long enough, it ends. And we're in a period where things have been bad for a long time, and it's going to come to an end. There's 84 million millennials who are coming online very slowly, and at one point they will overwhelm the system and they will start to demand reform in terms of what's been going on in the economy. Part of the legacy debt will guide that, and things will generally get better. I mean, perhaps not in this business cycle, but in subsequent business cycles, growth will pick up, employment will improve, wages will follow. There'll be real growth in earnings and income, and the debt burden will begin to ease, and people will have a little bit more sunnier disposition than they've had the past 5 to 7 years.
Well, that's something we can all definitely look forward to. Reyna, Debra, Joe, thanks again for your time and thoughts today.
Thank you for having us.
On that note, that's going to wrap up our show for today. I'd like to once again thank our guests for joining us and providing their very unique perspectives. If you like what you saw in today's show, please feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you have any comments, questions, or even criticisms for myself, feel free to reach out to me via email or Twitter. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. And remember, every life is a book. Make yours a bestseller. Have a good night.